Welcome. I'm Mara Gladstone, Director of Programs and Interpretation at Desert X. I'm delighted you're joining us today for Heavy Metal, Whiteness, Masculinity, and the Reparations Framework with Xaviera Simmons, Brandon Stosuy, Melissa Auf der Maur, MLMR, and Hunter Hunt-Hendrix. All of us are speaking from Indigenous land, and we pay our respect to the Indigenous people, past, present, and emerging, who have been here since time immemorial. Desert X takes place on Cahuilla land, and I acknowledge the Cahuilla people as the original stewards of the land. Desert X recognizes the life of Daunte Wright. His death this week, following that of George Floyd, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and countless others, demonstrates the continued inexcusable institutionalized violence against the Black community by police, not only in Minnesota, but across this nation. We stand with Mr. Wright's family and friends and all those who are hurting in our communities. You may be wondering why Desert X is hosting a panel on metal music. Inspired by the desert's layered geological forms, our public programming for Desert X amplifies the ideas and questions that artists and curators explored in the exhibition's development. Music, like many art forms, exists in multidisciplinary modalities, and its power to connect and create community is manifested through diverse experiences. Yet the metal music genre has created and sustained mythologies of whiteness and masculinity, while its audiences and its makers are markedly more complex. Today's virtual gathering connects to Xaviera Simmons' Desert X Billboard project titled Because You Know Ultimately We Will Band a Militia, which is now on view in the Coachella Valley. We invite you to explore her artwork if you haven't already, virtually or in person, and consider some of the ideas offered here. I'm excited to turn the program now over to Brandon Stosuy, music critic, music curator, and co-founder of The Creative Independent. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I wanted to invite you to, or welcome you to Heavy Metal, Whiteness, Masculinity, and the Reparations Framework with Xaviera Simmons. And thanks for the introduction, Mara. In the introduction, she brings up this idea of, why are we talking about heavy metal? And I think it's an important thing to sort of establish from the very beginning, like, why are we talking about this? And when Xaviera approached me about doing the panel, initially we were talking about this idea of James Hetfield, who is the singer and rhythm guitarist in Metallica. And she said this thing, James Hetfields, they formed me, and I need to reconcile and educate. They need to reconcile and educate every person. So this idea that heavy metal formed a lot of people from at a young age in their teens, and there's a reason why we were drawn to it. But then there's also a part of heavy metal that's massively exclusionary. This idea, in the title itself, the whiteness, the masculinity, this idea of these things that are perpetuated by metal. And so with someone like Hetfield, they form a person, and then they need to sort of reconcile and educate every person with some of the things that they're, framing and talking about. Don't tread on me, these kind of lyrics that come up a lot. Metal can be a great area for resistance and activism. And that was what I was drawn to it when I was a teenager. I felt like it existed outside of the small town I grew up in of 800 people. It felt, somewhat mythical, but also magical. It was heavy and physical. And I was drawn to it because it felt like a different space. I wrote about metal for a long time on Pitchfork with a column called Show No Mercy, and named after a Slayer record. And something we were talking about early on before we went live was when I did first start writing about metal on Pitchfork, I would receive a lot of angry letters, a lot of death threats. And there's a reason for that too, with these really, aggressive fans who feel very territorial about anything that steps outside of what may or may not be considered accepted within the metal framework. So I wanted to sort of start this by introducing the panel, and by introducing them, they can also kind of talk about how they were introduced into metal, what drew them to metal, because, no one on this panel besides me is a white male. And so it's, what drew each person to metal? So I wanted to start with Xaviera what was it that drew you to metal in the first place? And maybe, I mean, people know who you are, obviously, if they're tuning in, but maybe, explain why you're here and what is it that interests you about metal and what do you think we can do about it?
That's an interesting question. Well, first I have to say it's such a pleasure and honor to be with everyone on this panel. These are like amazing individuals, musicians. I'm like in awe and excited at the same time. I grew up I'm a Black woman descendant from slavery, and I grew up in a household, I grew up in the Black tradition. But, when you start to turn 12, 13, I used to buy my records. I had allowance. I would purchase my records. And then I started listening first I started listening to like a Bon Jovi type. But then, as any 12-year-old, starts to get, aware of what it means to grow up and be in resistance, then you start listening to punk rock. And then I started listening to, heavier stuff like Metallica and Slayer, alongside listening to Aretha and the OJs and all the things that my mom was listening to. So for me, I was listening to Mahalia Jackson and I was listening to Metallica. I was listening to Jimi Hendrix and then Slayer. I mean, that's just how it happened. And it formed me because it was always a sound of resistance and I took it as such. And so I took it very seriously with my friends. It formed a lot of my ideas around pushing boundaries and also with force. So I think that's how I came into it. And and I still listen to this day. I'll end there.
So Hunter, maybe if you could introduce yourself a little bit and also explain, what drew you to metal?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Hunter. My band is Liturgy. I feel like there's so much I could say about this. I'll try to keep it short. I mean, when I was in high school, I was in an experimental punk scene. I listened to a lot of like indie rock and screamo and stuff like that. And my interest in metal was really specifically in black metal, especially, and what drew me to devote my life to making black metal, I think, is I encountered it as something that was very kind of far away and mystical and magical, maybe kind of like what you were saying, Brandon. And I was very interested in religion and philosophy and classical music and that kind of thing too. And those kinds of aesthetics actually weren't very welcome in the punk scene that I was in. It was a very kind of unpretentious, there was sort of an imperative to kind of be scrappy and not say very much, not really have much affect or pathos or mysticism. And so I felt like black metal could kind of be a kind of container for me, combining all those things, but that was still that was still punk also, there was still anti-establishment that wasn't part of some system or whatever. And so, metal kind of had that. It was very exterior, even to the kind of outsider scene that I was already in. And it was almost a connection to almost more establishment things, almost in a way, if that makes any sense. But I don't know. I mean, I could keep going, but that's the basic idea.
So Melissa, if you could introduce yourself and explain what initially drew you to metal.
Lots of thread throughs with the others, and I suspect it will go on. But born and raised in Montreal, I'm the former bass player of Hole and the Smashing Pumpkins, which in many ways weren't heavy enough for me, but they were a gateway into the world of music. And I grew up in 1980s, and my gateway to the romance, the power of music was Morrissey and Robert Smith. So for me, it was the poetic souls, melancholy, and then in came creeping in the 90s guitars, Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins, Helmet was a big one for me, Slayer, and then Danzig and Typo Negative, which had the love aspect, which I was sort of looking for everywhere. And for me, the big ultimate gateway was this one album in 1991, and it's connected to the high desert, Desert X, Caius, Blues for the Red Sun. And that for me was the painting of these mythological pagan landscapes that I wanted to live in. It was the escape from the here, the now, the urban reality that I grew up on in the streets of Montreal, just being a very sort of like alternative shy teen who wanted a bigger world. Even so, there was. I think it's the escapism mixed with the power of a land far away. Actually, one of my favorite songs of all time still is 10 Million Year Trip on Blues for the Red Sun. And being of psychedelic in my nature, it was just like this land of flying free away from the here and now. But then here we are in the 21st century in this conversation, and reality is brutal and we must face it together. And that's why we're going to talk about it. But it was the escapism for sure, and the power and the sort of like bathing in this like other world.
So Em, if you could introduce yourself and explain, what drew you to metal?
So I'm Lamar. I don't make metal music per se. I would call myself more metal adjacent. And I mean, I of course have done a record with Hunter. My old band used to play a lot at this night in San Francisco at this place called Covered Wagon, this bar. And there was a night called Lucifer's Hammer, and it happened every Tuesday. But like once a month they would have a sort of a goth night. And I remember like opening for Thrones, this one show. The band I was in at the time was called Guillotine. And then I played shows with like Ludacra, the Bay Area legends. Everyone knows Ludacra, right? Amazing black metal band. So, I mean, my interest in metal sort of started, I think, with my voice, or with the idea of the voice in sort of opera. Like I'm obsessed with opera and opera singers since I was a very young child. And there was, at some point, I realized there was a certain kind of grandiosity that was like happening in metal that was also happening in opera. There were these like parallels. And I remember Seventh Son with Seventh Son, this Iron Maiden sort of record, being a really big deal in terms of its sort of operatic scope, and that it was sort of this like very grand kind of concept album. That was sort of a big thing. And then the blues, like, sort of like, because I'm more on the doom side of things, like, sort of, I'm a Negro goth, self-defined, but the doom sort of aspect of metal is always sort of the attractive thing to me. And so, of course, the first Black Sabbath record, the song Black Sabbath would be, sort of the preeminent like funeral doom, or their first funeral doom song. And that tritone that happens in that was a really big deal in terms of sort of thinking about Black Sabbath as this blues cover band. That's how they started, like sort of covering blues songs. And then that would lead them into this like sort of embrace of the devil with the tritone, and into this sort of heavy music was very, I just sort of felt like that was my kind of heritage, my legacy, my birthright, in a way to sort of continue in some way with that kind of modality. I mean, we understand that the blues grew out of the emancipatory moment that happened with the slaves, right? That Christianity was this thing that was enforced during slavery, and then once slaves were freed, they were like, well, we're not going to embrace this Christian thing. We're going to go sort of completely in the opposite direction and embrace the devil. And that was a very exciting moment in that it's synonymous with emancipation, with freedom. I think that a lot of people were talking already about this moment of like a kind of rebellion, this emancipatory kind of becoming that metal seemed to represent. Grand ideas, grand possibilities, and radical becoming was what metal represented to me, and still does, actually. And it's not the bourgeois world of opera. Like, it seemed like if you could insert a sort of operatic thing into something very heavy that was like not bourgeois, I'm always sort of been very anti-bourgeois. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah, I think it was important to establish early on that these are all metal fans, and everyone here was drawn to metal for a reason. Yeah. So I wanted to ask, really my first actual question, or real question, which is, so what is the problem with metal? Everyone's drawn to it. What is it that draws us here today to sort of talk about this? And it's in the title we talked about, these sort of constructs of whiteness and masculinity, this notion of reparations. What is it, with metal that is more problematic than the sort of maybe the things that drew us to it as teenagers, the mysticism and like the rebellion, the escape. But then there's also part of it that's very much steeped in reality and kind of unfortunately mirrors a lot of the things going on in reality. Like if you think about it, during the whole storming of the White House, of the Capitol, the dude from Iced Earth was part of that. Who's like a prominent metal person, and that wasn't shocking. So yeah. So what is it? What is the problem with metal? If anyone wants to go first.
I mean, I think that when you think about someone like Burzum and Varg and his kind of embrace of white supremacy, I think there's one of the problems is that any kind of metal or rock and roll or anything wouldn't exist without, Black people and the presence of us. And so that you can get from this sort of form that we created, rock and roll that sort of morphed into all these other things, from the spirituals and from blues, that then you can get to some ideology where, like we have nothing to do with this like art form that you've created, and then you can sort of hate us, is pretty extraordinary. So maybe it's about a historical thing that happened, maybe where this kind of white supremacist thing can emerge and a male supremacist thing can emerge. I mean, the incel turf kind of world that we're living in right now is so synonymous with a lot of threads that are happening in metal right now, which is really sort of depressing, because that's not the metal that the shows that I was going to. I mean, we were talking the other day about Behead the Prophet, like me sort of being in a mosh pit with all these like queer people making out with them. And, the metal that I sort of grew up with and imagine isn't that kind of white supremacist stuff. That's not really what I grew up in. And I think it's something about being ahistorical. I think it's something about the crisis in masculinity now. I think that white male it's been so critiqued that it's created a kind of anxiety that a lot of men don't know what to do with. Like they don't know how to process that, and they don't know how to process it with people of color and women and trans people. And so they're just sort of like trying to sort of empower themselves in a kind of seemingly in a rebellious way. And a lot of, unfortunately, the threads in metal and a lot of that kind of male aggression seem to be manifesting in that now. And I think that's unfortunate.
I'll say too, an experience I had just from interviewing metal musicians for years and years on Pitchfork is that it's also, very hard to get metal musicians often, not counting the folks here, but to say anything of substance. You sort of ask, like, if someone claims they're a Satanist band, you say, well, how do you worship Satan? They're like, oh, it's a metaphor, or how do you do this? There's never anything concrete. And that's why I stopped doing that column ultimately. I was getting, finding it harder and harder to find anyone who would say anything interesting, or like sort of, someone brought up the other day, but there's this idea of people reject discourse in metal. Like people don't want to talk about reality or talk about the facts all the time. It's very hard to get someone to sit down and talk. Like I can't imagine if we had James Hetfield here and say, hey, James, let's talk about this. It would be kind of like, when you see a sports hero after a game and they say, yeah, we played as a team. Good job. Like no one ever says anything. I think that's part of the metal problem too. Does anyone sort of come across that in their dabblings or in their interactions with metal? People don't really want to talk about reality quite often. It's hard to get people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like there's rebellion and there's rebellion. I mean, first of all, it's probably a broad brushstroke to say that like there's a problem with metal. I mean, metal. Some metal is great, some of it is problematic, but there definitely is some kind of like everyone can kind of feel there's like a general spirit that like maybe you acknowledge and then maybe distance yourself from if you don't like it, of certainly having a kind of aggressively patriarchal vibe or something like that. I mean, maybe that's not quite the way of putting it, but and of course, there's different metal scenes too. So, but like, I kind of think of it as sort of, what is one rebelling against? Because if you can sort of like a punk attitude will sort of accept a lot of the sort of fundamental articles of faith of like secular humanist modernity, like sort of freedom and equality and civil rights and progress and this kind of thing. But like you can also sort of reject modernity as such, or like not even want to think about modernity or what it is, and just not kind of just not get involved. And that's actually a sort of reactionary form of rebellion. And I think that in in like the late 20th century, in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was very easy to see like, civil rights and class politics and like the liberation of desire as such as all kind of being on the same side in some sense against a mainstream. But like these days it's, and I mean, there's always been this contradiction within metal of kind of being all these things, obviously, but then like these days, I think because like reactionary politics as such is something that has a lot more teeth. I think a lot of people who listen to metal are like, well, wait a second, what does this music mean? So, and yeah, I mean, as someone who's really into discourse, I certainly have had trouble, as someone who loves discourse and critical theory and reflecting on the form of culture that I'm working in and that kind of thing. Like it's there is real hostility against speaking.
I want to thank you, Hunter, for reminding me there's many realms of metal, and the problem isn't everywhere. Because I mean, my entry into it through the '90s music scene, where my sole goal was to make a female impact on a male-dominated landscape. So I was very much motivated by a female movement to create a space for us on stage and for future women. So obviously I spent a lot of time thinking about the masculinity component and the part, and I felt very comfortable with, but again, I was never associated or around the more extreme chauvinist or racist metal guys. I was in the 90s where everyone was a little bit this, a little bit that, and much more inclusive, but I of course did cross over into some of the more extreme metal. And I always felt similar to what we were talking about earlier, but the masculinity being the problem, and it's a reflection of all the problems on the planet Earth, which was males conquering based on this insane instinct to search and destroy, or to conquer and obtain. There's like a visceral DNA of the initial explorers, the male. So like that in some ways was what attracted me to that sound and that landscape, was this aggressive masculinity that is passionate to kind of overcome or take over. And maybe I was using less of a political lens because I was so focused on, I want a female in the room, I want a female on the stage. But I often just felt actually sad for the non-connected males of just like, there's like what you were saying, Brandon, about not a lot being said. Is there was like this like commitment to do the thing that thousands of years of pushing and building strong, but then not a lot. But then there'd be all these incredible lyrics about like mythology, and in some ways there was like a disconnect. And my weird sort of just personal realm in that was I was always hoping to connect the soul and the emotion and the person with this like crazy kind of animalistic thing. And I think a lot of that just has to do with like the male problem, and what and Lamar, you were saying earlier about just what is this male crisis we're in, of who they are and what's. So I mean, yeah, that's my thoughts.
I think a lot of it is that men aren't really taught. Oh, no,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I
just wanted to add one thing. I just wanted to say, for me, the reason why I made the work that I made inside of Desert X, which is there's to visualize it, there's motorcycles, there's a character with motorcycles with like Black, thinkers are kind of our heroes, whether it be Fannie Lou Hamer or James Baldwin. In my, if you want to talk about mythology and fantasy, my fantasy would be I would love to have a metal band that encapsulates it could be a white metal band that could encapsulate the teachings of James Baldwin, for instance, or understand the history of lynching. I mean, it's one thing to talk, for me, it's one thing to think about white masculinity and all of that crisis, but there's the total crisis of the fact of the United States itself, which is a crisis, and it's an imaginary space from the British Empire and other European empires. We haven't even dusted off that layer to get to, First Nations, Indigenous, trauma. Then you're going to get to 300 years. That's centuries, 300 years of chattel slavery, which is not really a part of the conversation inside of metal from what I've listened to for the most part. And then you're going to get into Jim Crow, the construction of the suburbs, and you're going to talk about, we had a conversation, and I know it was we had a lot of back and forth, but, when I think about metal and I think about garage bands and I think about that push, I mean, all of that is tied to policy inside of the United States and how that policy disenfranchised, of course, First Nations people, and of course, for 300 plus years, Black people. So for me, I've matured. I used to have a room covered in these, Dancing, Slayer, Testament, Death Angel, you name all these bands. Plus I was into punk rock in the Lower East Side. So I had it all, right? And I was, like I said, listening to my mama's music. I've matured. I'm a mature person, and I've listened to interviews with some of these folks, and they're still whether it's a character or not, while they have millions of dollars and they have children and all these things, they still are playing this part, this character of this like aggressive, you're like going on in your 60s and you're still playing the part of the angsty teen aggressor who's like frustrated, and you're seeking and destroying, and you're raining in blood, and you're doing all this stuff. I want you to mature, because your fans are still riding around the country with their "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and they're like, love it or leave it, and they're like, get out of here, and they're literally killing us. So I mean, I need to reconcile. Like we've said, the United States has its receipts. We understand this country, what is going on and what has happened. I need my musicians to, I have emotion and feeling and love and excitement and all the other emotions. There's a spectrum of emotions and fantasy. I need my musicians to also come correct at this point, like James Hetfield or Tom Araya or who all these, Pantera, or any of these folks. I would love to see, some of these folks, really take a clear political stance to help move the culture forward, because they have raised people, Black folks, Latinx folks, First Nations folks, white men, but they've raised a lot of white men. Come on. And they're influencing different parts of Latin America still to this day, Africa, all this stuff. And it's like, that's wonderful, but I need the critical discourse you can't just be lazy because you can. You can't just like not want to do it because you can. Like, where's the critical conversation of a mature person? We're adults.
But I think that's actually
Go ahead, babe.
Well, I think that's precisely the issue, though. I think that the crisis with masculinity, patriarchal masculinity, is that it refuses to grow up. It refuses to sort of leave a kind of adolescent acting out, where one is sort of being able to sit with their feelings and their emotions, process them in an adult way, take responsibility for one's actions and one's behavior. I mean, I think that the inability to sort of mature and to kind of be a fully formed adult is I think, a thing that, to bring up Baldwin talks about that in terms of America a lot. He talks about the fact that America is not being able to mature. It hasn't been able to grow up. And I think that that's especially applicable to patriarchy and to white male patriarchy. I think there's this like sort of perpetual adolescence that one is wanting to relive in that. I mean, I think that all the sexual adventures, that happen in masculinity, and I've certainly been guilty of that. I am male identified, for God's sake. All of those adventures, I think that all of that is a symptom of not wanting to sort of grow up and be a responsible person. Also, men aren't conditioned to sort of talk about, feelings and emotions, like being able to sort of, I think one of the things about my journey with critical theory, to sort of like piggyback on what Hunter was talking about in terms of being interested in ideas, is this kind of, there's a self-evaluation, there's a self kind of interrogation that one has to do, a self kind of discovery that one has to embark on before one can sort of even, I think, begin to address other kinds of issues. And I think there's a refusal I think that hopefully that's changing. I think like Gen X people maybe are a little more willing to sort of like look at themselves in an interior way, to sort of like male identified people, to sort of like have a journey and a search within themselves. Because I think that there can't be all of the reckonings that we'd like to have around race and gender and class. I mean, we haven't really even talked about class yet, because metal is primarily a working class genre, right? That it's coming from that kind of impulse. So we can't have reckonings around any of these things until everyone sort of really knows who they are, and not just who they are in this moment, but who they are historically and how they got here. And then we can sort of begin to talk once that happens. But if there isn't like a deep sort of level of self-reflection among all these men, I don't see how it's even really possible for a kind of reckoning. And this, extends upon redlining, all kinds of political questions that we want, political change that we want, actual reparations that we want. Like all of these kinds of things can't happen if people aren't like engaging in deep self-reflection and about why they're acting out.
Maybe like as an addendum to that, I hate to just like trash masculinity wholesale, you know what I mean? Like, there's definitely, I know that's not what anyone's trying to do, but sometimes I think maybe it's like a lack of integration in culture as such or something, because there's like a positive masculinity, I think as since transitioning, I kind of understand and kind of respect masculinity more than I ever did in a way once I was able to kind of distance myself from it in a more kind of complete way. And we live in a very fractured time, and metal's not the only problematic thing there is.
Oh no.
And but there's just a general, and it's also not the most powerful cultural force in the world by any means. Either. But there's definitely, the metal that I love the most is metal that carries a lot of emotion in it. In addition to the brutality. Maybe it's just a matter of taste or something, but I also think that there's a certain maturity in kind of holding violence and emotion together in music. And that's something that I always look for really in any kind of music, whether it's Converge or Bartok or, Stravinsky or something like that. And so, maybe it's just a general fracturing. Just a thought. I don't know.
I think something that M brought up and said we hadn't really touched on class yet, and I think that's something that we should touch on, and this idea of metal and the working class. And someone said the other day, and we were talking this idea of from the oppressed to the oppressor. It's sort of just something I scribbled down when everyone was talking, and I'm curious about that aspect of it. You have the metal as the metal, the working class, but to go back to James Hetfield, not just to target James, but it's there's now photos of James coming out of high fashion places, with all of his, particular gear and stuff. And he's changed his entire vibe, and these people are millionaires, and it's a different thing at this point, obviously, but they still are, a lot of their fan base identifies in that way and sort of sees them in that way. And we were talking about Tom Araya before. It's interesting, early on, we were talking about this panel. I reached out to a friend of mine who's a metal journalist, and I was like, maybe we get Tom Araya for this. And he's like, no. It's Tom Araya is a Trumpy, man. You're not going to get him to do this thing. He's supports Trump. It's all right, so that's out of it. So he supports Satan and he supports Trump. But it's so there is this kind of thing happening. I'm curious about that. Yeah, this kind of faux working class vibe of a lot of these bands, and they're appealing to working class people.
That's the thing, is that's why I made the work that I made, actually, is because I understand that we have probably a lot of shared affinities and knowledges, but I'm interested in talking to other people, right? I'm interested, because, I spend a lot of time in rural areas and upstate. I'm actually in Florida right now in a very Republican area, right? And I want to understand as much as be understood, right? I'm not here to just dictate. I want to understand that impulse. And and that's how I got to thinking about metal and Trump and all of this, is because it's, a lot of the fans, not all types of metal, of course, but, the kind of popular, the popular to underground, a lot of these folks are interested in Trumpian politics. And, the country's not going to go anywhere. So we need to understand something of what's going on. And even if they're haters, at least they're getting in their mind, like there's another narrative happening, and for me, which is why I had the character holding the Harleys, their vintage Harleys, holding these, representations of really Black history and with the fierceness, as fierce. You have Ida B. Wells inside of the image. So there's the motorcycle, and then there's the character holding the image of Ida B. Wells. I mean, she, really broke open journalism as far as lynching. I mean, I need these two things to come together, right? I need the Trumpian to understand the Ida B. Wells, and then we can get somewhere. But right now we're like, pedaling along, and I do believe that people can shift and change. And I do believe that people can get a knowledge and an understanding. I know that it's going to take time, but how much time do we need? So that's really what was behind a lot of the work and what I'd like to see, conversations I'd like to see.
And I think we can't forget that the 1%, the people who with the most economic power, have a real investment in working class white people and Black, all people of color sort of being against one another. I mean, I think that investment means that they can continue to financially exploit the white working class for votes for Republican politicians, as well as exploit people for, we know what happened with that union situation with Amazon in Alabama. I mean, I think that all of these things aren't sort of separate from what's been happening politically, culturally, socially in the bigger kind of sphere of what's going on with like corporations and the 1%, the ruling class. I'm sorry, Occupy Wall Street, I'm still there, in this like critique of that particular 1% thing and then there's been a movement since the 60s really, and the Reagan era really sort of solidified this, where you're pitting white working class people against all people of color, because the thing that they can, even though they have no money and even though there are no government policies that would assist them in any way to make more money, at least they're still white. At least they have this whiteness to hold on to. And I think that as this big identity marker has been huge for people who just feel like lost and destitute. I mean, and I think in a similar way that we found like metal and various kinds of like musical subcultures as kids, a lot of people are finding whiteness as their like this like moment that galvanizes them, that sort of gives them an identity, a sense of purpose. I mean, I think Stephen Miller, the weird, snaky, creepy guy who was in the White House for a long time, his sort of coming of age moment was like sort of realizing, even though he's Jewish and his parents are descended from like the Holocaust, he is still white, and he can hold on to that as an identity, as this sort of place from which to wield power and just sort of find a sense of self. I think as long as we're like kind of finding, my Blackness is, I get excited about, when I think about the history of what it means to be Black, what Fred Moon calls the Black radical tradition. I just get really excited. But that's sort of like being extraordinary under, really catastrophic circumstances. That what Blackness has made in terms of questions of love, in terms of music. I said the other day, and I always like to talk about free jazz whenever I talk about anything, being the one sort of Black musical form created by Black people that hasn't been fully and utterly commodified. That is the art form by Black people that has been the most existential, that is most an expression of our existential, transcendent longings and becomings. I get really excited about that. And I guess so on one level, I'm like, okay, I get the urge to want to like grab onto a cultural and historical identity that like gives you a sense of self, but the white, holding on to whiteness in that way, I think is, has led us to a lot of the moment we have now with Trump and with the Proud Boys and this new kind of branding of white supremacy, very old white supremacy, but new branding of it. I think I hear when we talk about wanting to understand the person who's different, the working class white person who is like, resistant to all of the
class. It's across, for me, it's across the spectrum.
Sure, yeah.
It's like, how do we How do you even, I mean, the works are on a highway, on a bill, you know, going, so you're going fast. So, you know, it's every person, you know, especially in that particular area inside of California, which the first billboard says California once tried to ban Black people, the same as Portland, or, you know, Oregon literally did, you know what I mean? So it's like, how do we reconcile with these things inside of all the different aspects of our cultural narrative here, and not just leave them to chance and hope. You know what I mean? There has to be a real concerted effort, not just from artists or critical thinkers, but also from sound artists, also from actors. You know, there has to be a willingness across the board to let Black folks, First Nations people, Latinx people, you know, lead, right? And so I'm telling you, I'm literally telling my white folks, like, listen, your metal, which I loved, which is fabulous, and like I grew up with, I got photos galore. The metal is part of the problem. You gotta like let that sit, and you gotta let that sit with you and let it simmer instead of trying to figure out ways to get out of that narrative. I'm telling you, as someone who's been inside of it and someone who I still listen, you know what I mean? I used to DJ, all of it. I still listen in and out of it, but I'm telling you, from understanding the culture and being in different cultures, that the metal as it stands and the characters that perpetuate it, they are the ones that the cops listen to in their cars. So what are we gonna do about that? I understand that there's alternatives, but the mainstream ones, the ones that we all know, that is who is informing and growing the 45 and plus year olds. So I need them to get some new wisdom somehow, some way.
Well, if they were all listening to Liturgy, maybe there would be a whole new world. And maybe we could sort of like have Liturgy infiltrate the police on the police station.
Come on.
That's the thing I was saying. I mean, I think, because I think that some of the like working class posturing of famous metal acts, like you're talking about, is kind of it's coded. It's not really working class posturing. It's kind of race. It's like race gender posturing in a lot of ways. You know, in an implicit way. You know, like, oh, I'm just a regular dude or whatever. But this question of like how to address it is something I'm trying to like. I mean, I think as like a practicing person, like with a metal band, like my attitude or I don't know if technique is the right word, just what ended up happening is I just sort of like just found a different audience, basically, you know, or like the one nice thing about the present with all of its fracturing that I was just complaining about last time I talked is that it's pretty easy to go your own way too, you know, and like, you know, I've never had any success, like, you know, convincing anybody who doesn't like what I do to change their mind. But like, there's a lot of people out there, you know, and like, there's people who can take inspiration in your music that just aren't maybe the people that like a marketer might think that your music is designed for. That's, I have a kind of a go your own way approach, I guess.
I think what Xaviera is saying, it's true. It's like the mainstream metal, that's the main issue. And I was thinking, Hunter, we've known each other for years and we've both been published in, you know, books about Black metal theory. Like there's an entire discourse around, you know, Black metal theoreticians, people who are teaching Black metal theory in universities. Like that's a thing, but then you don't really have, you know, Metallica theory or Slayer theory or whatever. And I think there is this difference. So yeah, it's the bigger stuff you hear, like, you know, people in war, like listening to metal to psych themselves up or whatever, you know, like, or people, you know, like Xaviera was saying, the police officers listening to metal, but that's the metal they're listening to. And that's the metal that has the biggest reach. Like the stuff that maybe we're drawn to, the reach is so much smaller and maybe people are thinking, hey, it's just not getting out there. And one thing I wanted to say, I wanted to remind people, if you want to text a question in, you can do that to 760-609-4036. So yeah, please text them. We actually got an audience question. So it says, I need the Trumpian to understand Ida B. Wells. I was really taken by the footage of Rage Against the Machine being used at a Trump rally tailgate last year. So it becomes a question that these listeners are not actually listening to the lyrics. What do you think about this willful ignoring or misreading of the lyrics of some very radical anti-fascist, anti-capitalist metal groups? How can we prompt and promote a close reading of this kind of metal that is radical and revolutionary? How can this subset of metal be influential in the broader genre? So that ties in what we're talking about. Anybody want to tackle that audience question?
I'm just going to remind everyone.
Oh, sorry, Melissa, you go.
It was just the question of that Nirvana song from Nevermind, which was singing to the guys who don't understand the lyrics. So this is like a many alternative anti-capitalist types of voices aware that when they become mainstream into this whole idea of a platform, and when you have a platform and you have millions of dollars and millions of followers, what do you do with it? I mean, the problem, generally speaking, as a Canadian American, is just the mainstream America is so corporate charged and so dumb. And it's not that the individuals are necessarily dumb, but I know people who from the 90s are gigantic rock stars that I am shocked by. Like, I went and founded a nonprofit art center where we've had Liturgy and MLMR. That is my idea of what I do next. And my concern is just the lack of people doing something next with their platform. And I was just a bass player, so I never made the millions or the millions of followers. I just did the right thing because I had the once in a lifetime opportunity to travel the world with a rock band and have a platform. And I use that platform every day. And all I'm thinking about in this conversation is Brandon and I and our music festival at Basilica and having Liturgy and MLMR come back. And I just like, that's all the answer I know is how do we just keep, but that's the preaching to the choir problem that we all know exists. And how do you infiltrate? But I didn't answer the person's question because that was too complicated. I just went with the song.
That choir needs saving too, though. I mean, that choir does need the message. The choir needs to hear something soul stirring. The choir is in some crisis, in that week, someone maybe died, someone maybe, and I get this whole other kind of question of what do we do in a bigger sense, but the choir needs it too. We need the message. I was just thinking about how I used to listen to Burzum. Like I would put it on, like the blast beats. I remember thinking were so kind of soothing and sort of like, and I guess, the burst beat is even more exhilarating, exciting. Our friend Hunter, but those blast beats were so sort of soothing and spiritual. And it's just such disturbing that I can't listen to it, because he's so deeply racist. Like I was just thinking about that sort of very spiritual moment I was having with the music. Like it was always a very spiritual thing to me, like metal, particularly black metal, and that it could then sort of be perverted by this thing is. So yeah. Anyway, the preachings of the choir. I'm sorry, I didn't need to chime in on that one.
Yeah,
the choir does need it.
Yeah, how can we promote, as the listener or the viewer was asking, is. Yeah, how can we prompt and promote a close reading of that kind of metal? I remember that footage of people, dancing at a Trump rally to Rage Against the Machine. Like how do we get people to know what the message is? Is it possible?
Yeah, how do you get people to want education? That's part of why I do like philosophy YouTube videos. My platform is pretty small, Liturgy's not like a huge band, like by any means, but putting, talks like this, obviously, like putting different sort of regimes of culture in communication with one another in like various like flickering ways. Lamar, you do that in your work really well too. You kind of like play DIY shows and like give lectures at institutions about, the historical meaning of your work. And like, because a lot of it is sheer, I don't know, I don't want to say like ignorance, that's kind of the wrong word, like sheer like contingent lack of interest, but like, because there are all these silos, so it's like, why would you look outside of your silo? But there's also so much opportunity to create connections between the silos that there used to not be. And so that's like, I don't know, that's something that's very important to me, is just sort of making music and then making discourse and then having them like linked to one another on the internet, it's like kind of a ham-fisted answer to that, but I didn't quite understand. I didn't hear exactly what the question was, or like, was I had to promote like specific kind of anti-fascist metal bands, or
it's just how can we prompt and promote a close reading of this kind of metal that is radical and revolutionary, and how can this subset of metal be influential in the broader genre? And this we got a few questions now actually, and one that ties into that is how can this type of reformation within masculinity occur except for between individuals? It seems like too much is left up to the consumer. It's too easy to turn away from music or art that challenges white comfort, especially in the emerging internet era. I think that's the big question is, how do we enact these sort of ideas?
I mean,
I remember. No, go on.
I think that, this ties into talking about reparations and the reparations framework, right? Like, I think we have to get, so as Em was talking about, the Reagan era, right? That's the era where we basically, not we, but folks gutted the government, right? Like they really were like, I want small government. I don't want them involved. And we started to get our music lessons literally taken out of our schools, and obviously it's going to be taken out of rural areas. It's going to be taken out of, Black and brown folks areas. So, I mean, we are at a moment where as artists, whether we be metal musicians, goth musicians, whoever we are, artists, whatever, we are at a moment where our citizenship can actually be more active, right? Like it's not just about like doing the artwork and like being mysterious and It's like, how do we participate in all the other ways that it means, especially in the United States where we know there's so much trauma, drama that needs to be reconciled. Like my vision, my excitement is that my children will not be having these damn conversations. Like I want them to be having some other next conversations that are really mystical, like what we're talking about, that are really like out there. You know what I mean? I want my children, to have the resources. Being a descendant of slavery on all sides of my lineage means, I have some resources, but I don't have a generational resource, right? So it's like, how can I ensure that my children and the group that I come from are able to have the resources so that they can fall in love with whoever they want to, be whoever they want to, shift however they want to. And if we really want to have people who can come into themselves fully, we need to be active citizens as musicians, as artists, writers, thinkers, whatever. So that's what I'm interested in, why I wanted to have this conversation and why I wanted to make that work, is because I want more younger folks, and hopefully bringing some of the older folks to come along and start thinking, I love Black metal, death metal, this metal, but I also am interested in learning about, Baldwin, Morrison, and all the others. I need that coming together. I don't know how you force it, but I know it is, like Hunter said, it is this, it is these kind of conversations where you bring different types of people together to hash it out. Even though we don't agree on everything, we at least are here for the dialogue that can, I'm sure there's a young person or a couple people or even older folks who are like, what? Like, I didn't know anything about MLMR. I didn't know anything about liturgy. I didn't know. Now I know. And I also am about to go get, the fire next time. So
I think the active citizen thing as a nonprofit runner founded in arts, but it's a very similar thing to the climate crisis. And it's the planet Earth, our mother, that the male domination has drained and mined and destroyed, is on a ticking clock. I personally, in our art center, we've put the climate crisis at the foreground. And when I do panels about the arts and culture role in the climate crisis, I'm like, it's not about the arts and culture. It's about me as a person, you as a person. Each one of us has to repair and rebuild, and it has to be a just and sustain. It has to be rebuilt. And same goes with the social crisis and the economic, social inequities. I mean, we have no choice for our children. And I do have a 9-year-old daughter that I fight for this exact reason for, is that they need us, and they're going to be pissed already. They already are pissed. They know what went down, the unacceptable behavior for as long as humankind. And we just have to be citizens and unfortunately, and I'd like to hear other people's opinions on this because I come from a family of freelance arty people. I'm like, I don't know that we have the luxury for art anymore. I get knocked down all the time when I say that. I'm like, how can we? We have so much work to do. And as a Canadian who's committed to staying in the US, because I want to help rebuild a little neighborhood in New York State with arts and ecology as part of the anchor. And that's all I know how to do now is be a citizen of a city in a small place. And I'm invested in, and I'm glad that not everybody's doing that, but a lot of people are, and more so. And I think COVID and the divisive politics of America has finally ignited everybody for their cause. But I think it's that question of, with such extreme pains out there and threats to a just future for all, how can we not be working as active citizens every day? I don't know. I personally can't, because we have too much work to do. And at the same time, people want to escape and transcend and make art. I get it. And I want to too, but I'm torn. And I think probably everyone on this call is probably pretty torn about that too.
Something that ties into that is another question that came in, and just this idea of capitalism and the economics of the music industry. And they ask, what are your thoughts on the capitalistic nature of the music industry and its efforts to market genre-specific attributes or aesthetics to consumers? How much does the marketability of a genre maintain masculine or white structures within a particular genre, such as metal?
Well,
so that's something
can I just jump in and say, capitalism in the United States is, the wealth that the United States has is the result of 300, I'm going to say it again, 3 centuries. First, it was the theft of land by force. Then it was 300 years. 300 years of free labor. Like, you can't just glide on by that. You know what I mean? That is like some crazy shit that we just are talking about capitalism and all this stuff. It's like the fungible thing were my ancestors, So that's the thing that made the thing. So you got to continuously drag it back. And I don't want it to be my job to do it. You know what I mean? I want to hear, white folks just be able to wax poetic about this. Drag it back. And I got to remind you, when you say capitalism, what you're really talking about is the construction of the United States based off of land theft, attempted genocide, and enslavement for centuries by white people. You can't escape that when you start this conversation. And I think all these conversations have to reference that in order for people to ground into it and recognize the reason why we are living in the conditions that we're living in right now. But I'm going to pass this on.
You have any thoughts on that? How, the fact that it is part of a big business and it is being marketed that way. There's another question that came in, and this one's about the scream, and it kind of ties into this, which says, on one level, metal is about anger, working class anger. Rap has played into racial anger, but metal has shied away from it. How do we get metal to embrace and voice these frustrations because they are worth a full-throated scream?
I mean, an interesting topic, kind of tangential to that, and that I was thinking when that previous question came up, which is that, metal is no longer the most marketable genre, and there aren't big, in any huge metal band that there is got huge in the 90s or earlier, So in a lot of ways, it's just like in decline as something, just because it's streaming and that kind of thing. But compared to something like rap, but in a lot of ways, rap is kind of like suffering some of this too. So many big rappers came out in support of Trump, and last year, and it's this issue of like one would want a kind of connection between music and emancipatory politics to be obvious, and it's just kind of getting less and less obvious across the board. That organizing in the name of a vision for a more equitable society has anything to do with any kind of music. And that's kind of a tragic thing, but it's all over the place.
Well, when Kanye West went to the White House and was there with Donald Trump, sort of speaking to him as if he was the father that he had never had or something, like I thought, this is it, like in terms of like this crisis of masculinity, this like sort of this sense of like some need for a father. I always sort of like thought it was really great that I didn't grow up with a father, because I just thought like that kind of patriarchy, like growing up with that being who I am, would be really even more violent than my patriarchal mother, in my life. So I think that there was something psychological going on about like, fatherhood and manhood and indoctrinations into a kind of traditional way of becoming a man that like a lot of people are buying into, of all races, clearly, not just, mostly white people, but clearly not the majority of Black men weren't going for Donald Trump, but a fair amount, he got more Black men to vote for him this last time than, the time before that. So there's something about this crisis of masculinity that Black men are feeling. Although I think that there's this other kind of like, lately, I was talking to someone about how rap, like hip hop these days, like the women are the really hard ones doing the really hard rap, and the men are more in this emo space. If you think about Little Uzi Vert or something, they're more in this kind of like, they're just like feeling things, which I like. But I would want to encourage them to feel more things, the music, and then move away from, all that sort of patriarchal capitalist masculinity. Because I think that one of the crises with music and capitalism, to go back to that thing, is that when you think about Black people in the history of us and the music here, and that all of the music that is American music arrives out of our pain and suffering, that it was our way of dealing with the day, if we're on a field, for hours and hours, like, being forced to labor, or it was the way that we sung to each other in private. That it was this, or was about like the Underground Railroad, if you think about spirituals, like how we're going to send signals to each other, and then that sort of became the blues, and it became rock and roll and rhythm and blues, and all of these things have been kind of taken away from us. When you think about, what capitalism does to music, you're talking about like souls, like you're talking about this soul thing, this like very sacred thing that's being marketed and sold and like distributed and then ultimately stolen by white people. White people are now, sort of the main makers of blues music, of rock and roll, of metal, of even like the most marketable R&B music is performed by white people. Justin Timberlake, Adele, Sam Smith. The most marketable thing. So it's like this, all of our labor continues to be sold, and we don't have a stake in it. We don't have like I think that's like the kind of, it's a soul murder, really, that like, mm-hmm. I don't know.
We're still in the belly of the blues. We're still in the belly of the blues while
That's right.
You have transcended and you're having your fun times and it's light on your feet. We're still, if you understand the data and you understand the statistics, the statistical data in this country, you understand that we are still, for the most part, the 14% of us, of this population, we are still in the bottom blues. You know what I'm saying? And that's why this conversation for me is important, because actually the way that M just beautifully described, we Black folks literally encapsulate the 400 years in ourselves. I can see like all his ancestors. And so I'm like, I see him, I need white folks to do that. I need white folks to see the slave master and beyond, and also the future, like the liberated one. How come I need y'all to talk about it like in that context too? Because we're here telling you all that is from, we're telling you all of the narrative, and we're here. But I need you all to do that same kind of like flow, and break it down, and not just live in the 90s and the 80s when you had like this kind of moment where you could be like aggressive and the kings or queens of the castle. Now it's time for you all to break down the opposite or the other side of the story that M just did in like 2 seconds. Because we live in that. We live in that whole spiral. And that's the thing. You got to get us all to start living in that spiral the way that he just did it. so that we can
also
talk to ourselves in all the different ways that we need to talk to ourselves.
I think the double consciousness thing, the Du Bois idea of this double consciousness, for those who don't know, like that the Black person has both the consciousness of what it means to be Black in the US, as well as a consciousness of what it means to be white, because we have to sort of understand both sides. That I think that could, maybe what you were just saying is that, like, maybe all white people need that same kind of consciousness, that doubleness, where you're sort of simultaneously walking with whatever your history is, with whatever your dilemmas are, as well as the dilemmas of Black people, as well as the dilemmas of, like, indigenous people, of Latinx people, that maybe that's the moment we can come to. And I mean, I don't want to.
The burden has to get on you somehow.
Yes.
You gotta carry the burden, and going into reparations, it's slavery was a government sanctioned thing. So reparations needs to be a governmentally, sanctioned thing, and it's going to come out of all of our resources, whether we're a musician or whether we're artists. It's going to come and provide for the group that, and many other groups, I'm sure, have cases on the United States. So it's about, like,
yes, they do, yeah,
or that you equal and go beyond, because this is centuries that we're talking about, that we're just in a limbo, and anyway. Brandon, you go ahead.
I think that, there was what I had from our discussion the other day, and what I kind of wanted to end with, as we have about like 6 minutes left, is how do we go beyond talking about it to finding a way to provide the actual resources? How do we make that move? We're talking in metal specifically. Metal people don't want discourse, don't want to have a conversation. It's a much bigger thing. The questions that came in from some people that are watching, how do we get people to pay attention? How do we get people to have this consciousness, this double consciousness? How do we move beyond the conversation to something concrete? Is it possible, do people think? Do people have a way that it could possibly work?
I would love to hear from Melissa or Hunter.
Well, I was going to say, similar to the masculine, the question, the one-on-one, male to male, figure it out, is that the way that I have embodied, say, the last year of sort of epiphany awakening between the virus and Black Lives Matters in the little town that I live in, New York State, is that I have definitely had like a kind of like, I've been like pedal to the metal, busting my butt, doing whatever my projects are for the past 20 years. And I've had this a good coming of age moment where our art center is fully revisiting how we can serve the citizens most in need in Hudson, and pivot our nonprofit to specifically address our neighborhood needs. That's how I'm going to do it, because I personally, I think we can have conversations always, and part of these big panel conversations, I bring home then to the vision of how I want to affect and lend support in a post-COVID, post-Trump, post-truth world in a tiny town in the United States. I want to build it one block at a time. I'm going to do it in my little way with these conversations I'm having locally as well as nationally. This is really helpful for me to have a national dialogue with such incredible, beautiful brains and creators. So thank you. I'm going to just bring it home and continue applying it to my local conversations of what we can do, in our case, to create jobs for the 20% living under the poverty line with no access to education or training to any real jobs, unless they want to work in the tourism industry at the restaurant, which is not a cool job for people who are looking for a long, expansive career. So that's personally how I'm going to do it. But I feel like each one of us has to find your place and your niche. And Hunter, how are you going to do it? Or how are you doing it? I know you're doing it.
Well, I guess one small way I can think of is just like more like sort of representation and promotion of people of color within metal. There's really a lot of subtle gatekeeping, where like it's like most people who make metal are white, and male, but like and it's not really an explicit gatekeeping, but like when I think of like the metal scene, I guess a lot of this conversation has been about sort of representation within like huge, for like huge metal acts. But what I experience in metal more immediately and frequently is like the like scene politics, sort of like what it's like to be at a metal show and have friends who play metal and the kinds of things they talk about and the kinds of people who are welcome, and who are given the opportunity to like get record deals and have audiences. And so like, that's a very kind of humble thing to do, I guess. But it's, we're in this kind of scenario where there's very little collective agency. So it's like, when one finds agency in the ways one can, I guess.
I have to say that it took almost an hour, but we got a question about Vikings, and it's a pretty broad question, but I want to acknowledge it and I want to read it. And we might not have time to answer it, but I think I want to acknowledge that we got this question about Vikings. So it says, there have been a lot of conversations about US white nationalists' fixations on the visual culture of European medieval traditions. I'm thinking about subgenres like Viking metal and the types of heroic masculinity and whiteness these genres are promoting. For these majority white nations, how should they be aware of these international dynamics? What are their responsibilities as bands producing for a global audience? How should they think about the local, Finland or Denmark, for example, versus the global? It's a huge question, and we only have 3 minutes, but I wanted to at least bring that up. That is something to think about. And I don't know if anyone has an immediate response to it, but it's just out there now in the world, and maybe people can get to work on it.
I just think that anyone who's playing anything like rock and roll, go on.
I think I tell if it's a trolling question or not.
I think it seems real.
Yeah, what were you going to say?
I would just say, taking it seriously is not a trolling question. I would just say that everyone playing rock and roll or any kind of like sort of popular music really needs to just sort of always be sitting with the fact that it probably came out of a U.S. slave, sort of like slavery context, neo-slavery context, Jim Crow context, lynching. It probably came out of something having to do with Black people and our particular kind of enslavement in the U.S. I just think, it's always a good idea just to sit with that fact. It's really a fact. And if you're not with that at every moment having a certain reverence for that, a certain kind of like sense of the sacred, of the holy with that, then maybe you need to, reevaluate your life.
And we were talking the other days of you brought up this, this venue in San Francisco that's gone. That was like a blues venue, and that kind of a very like.
Well, crazy enough, I was invited to do a show in Norway, and I drove all around the country, and I kept thinking like all I wanted to do, because I was thinking of the black metal scene there, and I was thinking I just wanted to do like an SOS, like help, like, because Norway with their oil money, I was like, do you understand what you love and what you're interested in the United States? Like the people that you're, excited to, exactly what Em was saying, like, do you understand, like, we are in crisis here? Like, there's an SOS, even though I'm going to enjoy your country. It's gorgeous, and you're sad.
I played in Norway twice, and I love Norway. The food, the fish, if you like fish. In Oslo, I was in Oslo the last time, like it was 2019. The most amazing fish in the world, maybe. So I love Norway, and everything you're saying is absolutely right. It is a wonderland in a way. It's a wonderland of a certain kind of escapism. Like my anxiety about like race, the way that I experienced in the US, really dissipated. It sort of disappeared the last time I was in Norway. I was like, oh wow, I really don't feel this anxiety that I feel all the time about, sort of like just my safety. And so that was sort of nice, but then it seemed like it was hiding this other reality, like you said, like there's this other reality there's in another part of the world.
Exactly. And then just to close it out, the way, just to be real basic, you guys, I'm just going to say the way we all know CBGB, for instance, right? Like none of us knows Ruthie's Inn, Ruthie's Inn, San Francisco, Black man, he needed money. He was like, I'll let these folks play. Enter the whole San Francisco scene, that all the bands you love, that was like birthed midwife by this like wonderful Black man who we don't know about. I would love to have, and I would love to have all metal folks give respect to that, because that's helped push, that club, along with a lot of other clubs, have helped push the genre along, but you don't even have an association. And it goes again back to thinking about, you don't even have an association from where the music comes from. And we need to, it needs to be embedded in the DNA of the sound so that we, or not in the sound of the conversations, right? Like it should just be in every conversation from now on. It's like, well, you know, slavery and the blues. Well, and I don't care if it's repetitive, but you need to, the reason why I'm having this conversation is I'm looking for a wholeness with Black folks, like in particular, but a wholeness for us all. Like we all of us are fractured because we don't even understand the place that we live in, you know? So Ruthie's in, CBGBs, all the other clubs you love and cherish, you need to know that a lot of them were nurtured by Black folks.
Well, that's one thing James Hatfield could do is pay for a documentary about Ruthie's, because when I was describing that place, it's like, why isn't there an amazing documentary? He should be paying to tell that story and have it be part of the conversation. And then
there is a documentary called Murder in the Front Row that like kind of really references it. And it's and he's in it and they're all in it. All those folks are in it. But yeah, like, can you uplift? Can you pay for? Can you make repairs? It's not that hard, you know? It's not that hard. Make repairs. You're exactly right, Melissa. Like, that's a no-brainer. Bring that story, like make a new Ruthie's and let it be like for young folks to play in metal and rap, blues, goth, whatever. Let's go.
Yeah. No, I think it's possible. It's a matter of like reaching them, and maybe it's the next generation that's going to do it and not the last. We don't know. I have to give my one Viking story. Is before becoming a mother and founding a nonprofit, my last solo album, Out of Our Minds, that was really popular in Norway, just so you know, is I made a fantasy film that accompanied it, and I was a flying black-haired, black-eyed witch that got to cut the heart of a Viking out and give it to the dying trees that were bleeding in the forest. So I have already done that in my fantasy. I've killed the Viking and I've given the heart back to the forest. And that's what I'm going to do from this day on every day.
Yes. I love it.
So I wanted, we've reached our end, but I wanted to thank everyone for this amazing conversation. And if you missed any part of it, the whole program is going to be available online for future viewing, so you can watch it over and over again, go back over your favorite parts. And just thank you, everyone. This is incredible. And I think people get a lot out of it. So appreciate it. And thanks for having us, Xaviera. Thanks for coming up with this concept and inviting us.
Oh my God, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
You're like my new BFFs. I really need to check back in. And can I just say one last thing? I'm sorry I'm going over. Everybody out there, you need to support these musicians because hello, COVID, like I don't even know how the hell you guys are making a living because you can't play out.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not.
So support these musicians, listen to their sound. They're amazing. They're my BFFs.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you.
And Desert X.